Great. So why don't we do this? Why don't we start this session? And, as others join in, we can always fill them in later in terms of what and how. But once again, good morning. Thank you very much for attending and participating this session. I hope you and your loved ones are really, doing well and staying safe. We always thinking of the students, not only the Walker College of Business, but students in general, and an app for sure. I always think about them. I'm really concerned. Then I want to make sure that you're all doing well. Before we get started, please note, you can probably see on the left-hand side of your Zoom screen that we are recording this particular session. And most probably this recording will be available to you if you so desire, if you do request it. I am going to read something because the person I'm going to introduce, who you can already see probably in one of the tiles, Dr. Willie Fleming. There's a lot that I can tell about him. So instead of trying to memorize, okay, I'm going to basically introduce him and then turn over the proverbial mic to him, and so that he can get started with the session. So, like I said, it is my pleasure to welcome you to this session on microaggression and implicit bias. Dr. Willie Fleming, if you do not know, he's the Chief Diversity Officer here at Appalachian, and he's the guest speaker for our session. A little introduction, and although I do not know whether little would do justice or not, because there's, like I said, there's really a lot to say about Dr. Fleming, but he is a two-time Appalachian graduate. In 1980, he earned his BS in art education, and then in 84, his MA in student development. Dr. Fleming has a PhD in counselor education from the University of South Carolina, Columbia. He's the founding member and the first director of the Appalachian Gospel Choir. He's the founding member of the Black Student Association and the Black Faculty and Staff Association, and an advisor for minority students. He has also helped university administrators establish the National Pan-Hellenic Council fraternities and sororities for African American students. Remember what I said? There's a lot more I can, okay, but I'm going to try and keep it short. But that is the part that I wanted to read just a little bit. I've had the opportunity of listening to Dr. Fleming talk, and I've really enjoyed it on multiple occasions. So I know you're going to enjoy this particular session. Not only is he a great orator, but he is also very inspiring, and what he talks about is very, very thought-provoking. So it is my absolute honor to welcome Dr. Fleming and you all to this particular session. Dr. Fleming?
Good morning, and thank you all so much for letting me see your faces and beautiful pictures of you as well. I want to share a little bit this morning, and I'll certainly give you an opportunity to ask questions, but I'll probably, if you will, speak for the first 20 minutes or so, and if you have questions that are just burning, if you would just write them down so that you won't forget them, and also just work with Zoe as well. Microaggressions and implicit bias is really where we're coming from today. And as we consider those two, that is how we really have, if you will, an inclusive community here at Appalachian State. I think the rules of engagement probably are not necessary today because of the format that we have. So I'm going to skip that part. The only thing I want to just impress upon you is that you just consider, or that we consider, everybody's not in the same place in terms of our cultural competencies. And so if you hear something today that doesn't sound so politically correct, for the sake of just educating each other, or this being an educational situation where we're learning about implicit bias and microaggressions, that we will not storm each other, but that we will just understand that there are some folk who may not understand this right now. Now, I'm going to contradict myself before this presentation is over, because I'm going to also impress upon you there are those times that you're going to have to confront microaggressions and inappropriate comments that are made in your schoolwork and in your everyday lives. I want to cover today, of course, implicit unconscious bias and how it's manifested. We're going to just touch on the 8 social identities, microaggressions. I'm working with a very sensitive mouse here. So if my screen flips back and forth, that's what's happening. Microaggressions, micro assaults, micro insults, and micro invalidations. The last 3 really all kind of fall under the umbrella of microaggressions, and I'll explain that now. Microaggressions are those everyday denigrating comments that people make. And most of the time, a microaggression is something that is said that is really unintentional, but the impact, so the intent is not to be hurtful, but the impact can be. For example, you are really good at math for a girl. We understand that that is just loaded with contamination, although it is meant to be a positive statement made to another person. But what actually happens is that it is offensive. A micro assault is usually probably more intentional. It's an insult. It's really a statement or an action that's really meant to be hurtful, but more so just really a lot, really harsh. Micro insults, sometimes again, they're more intentional than just oversight. And micro invalidations, most of the time, are not intentional. However, when a person uses a micro invalidation, they really make the other person appear to be invisible. For example, many of us have been in meetings, in clubs and organizations where you made a statement. You might even have been in a classroom and you gave an opinion and you thought it was a pretty good opinion. However, it was like crickets. No one responded. Nobody said anything. 15 minutes later, someone else said the same thing you said. I mean, almost word for word. And there's elation in the room. And it's like, what happened? You were made to feel that what you said was not important. And the other person, and so when you were made to feel that way, that was a micro invalidation. Or you're trying to explain yourself and someone just doesn't receive what you have to say. Again, you're just made to feel you're not validated. And sometimes a comment may be made that actually tries to reduce the impact of what you're saying. All right, so let's get into this thing. And I'm going to share a little bit about internalized oppression, but probably will not get a chance to get in the weeds with that like I would really like to. We just simply don't have that much time. I'm going to ask you right now to think about a time that you experienced a microaggression. It could have been from a family member. It could have been someone in your religious organization. Could have happened to you in a classroom. But if you would, think about that just for 30 seconds. I'm not going to have you do the 5-minute presentation here, but I'm going to ask that you, if you will, that you would just think in terms of what happened to you, what offended you, and if you would, having just a few problems with this mouse. If you would just share in the chat box what happened here we go. What happened, what words describe how you felt as a result of that? If you just put that in the chat box at this time, what words describe how you felt as a result of that offense? It could have been something said to you by your parents, could have been something said to you that, again, the intent was to be positive, but actually it was just really hurtful. And if you can't think of a time when someone was unintentional, think about a time that you know it's just outright shade, and you don't tell me about the incident, but if you would just write in the chat box, what word describes how you felt as a result of that? Yeah, exactly. Small, insecure. I remember as you continue to write in the chat box, I remember my freshman year in an art class, my professor was talking and he was just kind of rambling. And he said, he talked about a woman who was really offensive. And he looked at me. There were 6 students in my class. I was the only person of color. He looked at me and said, Willie, she was one of your kind. I was so offended and I was so hurt by that. Yes, this is what I'm seeing. So he didn't have a clue what he said was so offensive because I think he felt the relationship we had that he could really say those kinds of things to me and it would be okay. That was not okay. It would never be okay for someone to be that way with me, but he was just that way. All right. So Jackie, thank you for that comment. Showing you look so young. Are you old enough to be working at a university? Wow. Okay. And so there's some real assumptions being made there about youth and intelligence. Connor, made to feel small, insecure, vulnerable, upset, hurt, invalid, invalid efforts. Exactly. These are the kinds of things that we have to be aware of. And I tried to really make sure that you talked about something that you have experienced because my background is counseling. I trained mental health and school counselors for years. Daryl Stu, who talks a lot about microaggressions, he says this that's highlighted here that I'd like you to pay attention to, and that is, do I want to be someone who contributes to a stressful and hostile environment for people around me? And so that's a question that you and I should ask ourselves every day and in all the spaces that we're in. Do I want to be someone who's going to make another human being feel small, make a comment like you look so young, or you don't look old enough to be working here or doing the work that you're doing? Do I want someone to feel insecure as a result of them experiencing my space or statement that I made? Do I want someone to feel vulnerable, upset or hurt as a result of something I said? And invalid. And it was easy for you to get a school scholarship, and of course, colleges love you, love you. They are always looking for a token minor. Oh my goodness, I've heard that one. I've heard that one, and whoo, I feel my blood boiling right now because it's like the thing that they think got me into the university is probably the thing that I struggle, that's my struggle to stay in the university. And I sometimes have to work, and I imagine you are suggesting, you who wrote that, you're probably having to work twice as hard sometimes because of the same thing that people feel was your advantage getting into college. And so these are the kinds of things. Now, some of us might think, well, that microaggression, that everyday denigrating comment, just to hear that once, to hear that, why are you so upset? Well, for people coming from marginalized communities, it's not something they hear once in a while. Matter of the fact, Howard Ross would suggest to us that microaggressions are like death by 1,000 paper cuts. When you've heard something like, especially this last comment, and thank you also for Jackie and for Jamie for your comments in particular, but when you've heard something like that and you hear that several times a day, it really starts to beat down on you. It starts to affect your psyche, and um, and not only do you hear that sort of thing, then there are these other comments. You hear microaggression, micro assaults. You get micro assaults, micro invalidations. Many of the women at this particular on this session, especially in the more clinical fields, you're not always seen as someone who is as competent as the men. If it's in math, if it's in science, and so you're hearing that kind of stuff all the time. And this is your career. This is what you're paying good money tuition for, but you're hearing these kinds of comments sometimes from the folk who are supposed to be encouraging you, and you're kind of getting beat down. Now, why did I ask you to talk about a time that you experienced that? And it looks like everybody responded. And that is because microaggressions and implicit bias is not just something that marginalized communities experience. All of us do. Every person on this Zoom has probably experienced, I'm sure you've experienced a microaggression. I'm sure and I'm certain that you have been the victim of implicit bias. And so I want to normalize this so that we will not make the assumption that only people of color and only women or only folk from certain underrepresented communities experience microaggressions or implicit bias. We all experience them. And Howard Ross, again, a wonderful theorist, would suggest to us that we all possess bias. It's not a matter of whether we possess bias or not, it's identifying what the bias is. And so we know that we need to be very, very keenly aware of that as we interact with other folk. Go back to this slide just again. Thank you all for those comments and in the chat box. I want to share with you now a short video. It's only about 4 minutes long on microaggressions, and we'll go to that now. Thank you all for being so patient too. You probably can tell that I'm not the most tech savvy person here today. All right.
I guess I'm still learning how to deal with microaggressions, with mental illness, and being a Black woman. It's something that I've always had.
The majority of the microaggressions that I've experienced in my life are related to being half Japanese. People often say that I am pretty far a Black girl, for example.
Oh my God, Kiana, like I'm Blacker than you are, Kiana. Like, oh my God.
From your name, I thought you'd be a little Jap walking off the streets.
Oh, you're super pretty for a Black woman.
You know, a lot of people, they want to like touch hair. It's one of those actions where they're just like, oh, can I see your hair? And they just go and like pet it. When you pet something, you know, you pet animals. You know, like we're humans, we're not animals.
The biggest one I get all the time is, what are you? What are you? And then they rattle off, because I'm so ethnically ambiguous, they rattle off this list of like, oh, are you Mexican? Native American? Puerto Rican? Yada, 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 yada. Why do you need to know that? I don't think it necessarily changes my intelligence or anything like that. It's just that you can put me in a nice little box.
It's disheartening to have people tell you you don't look like a particular group of people that you self-identify with. It's hard because I do self-identify as a Hispanic. I was born in Chile in South America. I feel like, how Chilean can I get? You know, I don't know what else to do. But then I try to model correct behavior. So if somebody says, where are you from? I will say, well, I grew up in California. But if you're talking about my ancestry, I'm Korean.
I have definitely experienced microaggressions the way that I look, whether it's like body type, especially. I think that's maybe one of the hardest.
I think it's a reality of privilege that you don't have to notice microaggressions.
What gives me a sense of agency to address microaggressions is honestly the identities that I have that are privileged. I think sometimes when a microaggression is done to me or others, I'm pretty quick to respond back or to clap back. But I often think sometimes that's hard to do. There are those times where, you know, you want to educate that person. And there are those times where you just want to run away. But there's some times where you just have to have a good laugh.
I wasn't strong enough to say, like, what the heck? Like, what is, like, why did you say that? I wasn't strong enough to say that. And so I just had to, like, internalize my hurt and then kind of move on.
A lot of times, I don't think that people are trying to, what would you say, send microaggressions on purpose. I think that a lot of times microaggressions are, you're just not educated on what needs to be said or what you should say.
I think a lot of times people really just don't understand the impact of their words or their comments or something that has become a colloquialism in regularly exchanged conversation in our culture. A lot of times microaggressions are unconscious and people don't realize the impact. And a lot of times that wasn't their intent at all. But at the end of the day, it doesn't matter about intent because it matters about how it impacted you. Trying to help students to understand that we all have biases. They may not necessarily be, you may not necessarily know them, that know exactly what they are, but I think we all have them. And once we can learn to understand those biases, I think that would be an important first step to understanding other people and their life experiences.
When I get challenged, it's hard and I feel embarrassed. And I'm somebody who thinks about that a lot. But I also want to honor the fact that I was the one who made that impact on the students. So you think about intent versus impact.
I think it's hugely important not to let that microaggression just pass by without anything being said. Because being silent is, to me, as an educator, stating that you agree with that particular microaggression.
Okay. So let's just get out of that altogether. All right. Zoe, I think I will entertain some conversation or questions. You guys heard quite a bit about intent. In other words, microaggressions have oftentimes, unless it's a micro assault or micro insult or micro invalidation, and sometimes they're intentional, but for the most part, microaggressions are really denigrating everyday comments that people make, but they're not made with the intention of being hurtful. So you heard this conversation from a few of the folk in this video. They talked about intent versus impact. In other words, the intention was not to be hurtful, although the impact of what was said was really hurtful. Can I get some responses or thoughts after watching this video, even if you want to share about an experience you might have had that you really thought that you were saying something nice, or you thought that you really did not intend to be offensive? Any thoughts about what you saw there?
I'll share one experience that I've had. We talked about earlier before this call, me starting to work with the college, and I had come from a smaller town, and I hadn't had a lot of experience to different cultures' names. And so when I was first learning, I would ask people to go over their name with me. And I didn't realize that that is something that I could do on my own. Like, I can go on YouTube and I can find out that pronunciation and work on that on my own without assuming that person's supposed to help me with that.
Okay. And so what was your intent, Zoe?
I was trying to learn the person's name so that I would be able to greet them when I saw them. But I was told that the way that made them felt was I was not taking the time to learn their name as I would with any other name.
Okay. And so your intent was just the absolute best. I mean, you came from such a noble, honorable place, but the impact was, and say that impact again.
Hurtful.
It was hurtful. It was
Yeah.
like you weren't taking the time to do this yourself. And would anybody like to respond to that? Does that make sense to you? I love what you said, Jackie. Anybody want to comment to that? Anything that you don't get it? Because it's okay if you don't get it. That's why we're doing this session, if you don't get it. Would somebody else give another example? Or just your comment about the video? You guys are so full of conversation this morning. I love it.
Well, Let me just say something very quickly, and I do not want to, take anything away from the students because I think it's their session, so they should be. But for me, awareness is one of the biggest things. Most of what we are talking about over here, for me, I was not even aware. And that is what makes so much, for me, it's so valuable that, in order for you to change, you first have to be aware of what is happening. So I think in terms of an observation, awareness is a big thing. And all of these things, they make us aware of how we are doing things that might have effects. We might not be thinking, but that might have an effect on someone, which is much more detrimental than we could ever assume.
Absolutely. Absolutely. And when I train mental health and school counselors, one of the things that's the thing I impressed upon them throughout the entire graduate program, self-awareness, to be aware. And when someone honors us by making us aware, even if it's something that is hurtful to us because they just made us aware of the impact of what we said, that is really, that's something that we should value, that someone made us aware. Like I said, I kind of cheated you guys by saying if you heard something today that was not politically correct, don't pounce on anybody. And I said that with the intention that some folk are afraid to speak up and to speak out because they're afraid they're going to say the wrong thing. And for the purpose of this teaching situation, I've kind of asked that. But again, now I'm about to absolutely contradict myself because I think that there are those times you have to say, you have to speak to what's happening around you. And so and Zoe said it very well, and I think I heard one other person comment. When you experience microaggression, you have to name it. When you hear microaggression, you have to say something like, I think we just heard a difficult comment made in the room that everybody is uncomfortable with, and start the dialogue. What are people feeling in the room right now, not now? If there is silence, talk about what you heard and model the difficult discussion. And as a professor, when I train mental health and school counselors, I intentionally left 30 minutes after class every night. My classes were evening courses. And I drove to Charlotte after leaving Garden Web. My classes ended at 8:50 p.m., but I left 30 minutes in case something happened in class that we want to deal with, because I was really concerned about making sure my classroom was a safe space, that it could be a brave space for students and not just a comfortable space. And I'm going to ask you to make some comments on that in just a minute. So if a student says something, and sometimes it had nothing to do with race, it may have been that I may have had a student from the LGBTQ community, or a student who was really from a small town, and a comment was made about people from small communities, but it was a microaggression. It was done in a way to really be demeaning. Matter of fact, I think it was in many cases they were micro assaults and micro insults. I would ask the student at the end of class, did something happen tonight? And 9 times out of 10, that student would say, yes, Dr. Fleming, this particular thing happened. And we talk about that, and my next question is usually, what are we going to do about it? Because I realize if I allow certain comments to be made in my classroom, then the culture was, you can say whatever you want to say in Dr. Fleming's class, and it's not going to go unchecked. And I could not afford for anyone to feel or to be unsafe on my watch. It just was not going to happen. I would often encourage students to then, the 2 students to talk if it was between 2 students. And, but sometimes if the student said, I don't feel comfortable, and if something was said in the classroom that affected everybody in a certain kind of way, then I would tell the student, I plan to talk about this in class, next class period. I didn't care what I had to teach. It was important to create an environment whereby learning could happen, and where folk would know that they are safe. And I always say not feel safe, but are safe. And so we would take that time. Every now and then a student would say to me, Dr. Fleming, I already feel like I don't belong. I already feel like I don't really fit in. Please don't say anything. And so I would tell that student, today, this time I won't. but if this happens again, I have to say something. I have to say something because I don't want this person to bully another person in the class. And believe it or not, a lot of times we, in that particular when I was working there, it was really more class situations, like wealthier students kind of snob students who were not as wealthy. I mean, I dealt with a lot of that. Even in the video, someone talked about body image. If you don't look a certain way, how we tend to discriminate against folk who are not thin. So that we have all these considerations that I think that we need to take into account as we're dealing with others. Okay, questions or comments before we go any further? All right.
Dr. Fleming, can I ask a quick question?
Certainly.
And I'm sorry, I do not mean to usurp the stage, but
No.
I always feel that nowadays, especially in today's climate, in the United States and probably also in my country, India, I see the same thing. You know, this phrase politically correct is damaging a lot of things. What is rude is rude. Okay, you cannot say, oh, you know, don't be PC about it. It's not that. I mean, people use this phrase and they cover everything to be offensive and to be rude. But what I don't get it is, why don't they, or maybe they appreciate, but they just don't want to, because we have this herd mentality to be with the group and not stand out. And that's what amazes me, that, you know, we're using this, you know, politically correct thing, and we say, oh, you know, this is too much. You know, that is, I'm thinking, is there a way to kind of get over that? And that probably makes someone very salient, that, you know, one will stand out and say things, and people say, oh, he'll always or she'll always have something to say. Just an observation.
That's an observational question. Was that an observation or a question?
No, that just was an observation. And I was thinking, if there is a way, my question is there a way to kind of make people understand that this is not about political correct, that's a completely different domain. This is about, you know, basic human nature, that, you know, what is rude is rude. How can you make people understand that?
I think the word you use, human or humanity, as we look at what's happening in our nation today, marginalized communities are saying to those individuals who have power, have privilege, and have the advantage, is that at least recognize my humanity. When we make certain comments and we say certain things to individuals with total disregard to the fact that this is demeaning, this is hurtful, we're not respecting that individual's humanity. I see it too often in work situations where I think, why doesn't that individual get the same consideration as that individual? And it is absolutely, I'm devastated each time that, as you're suggesting, it's not we can use the term politically correct, but it's just not even correct, you know? Let's be correct, let's be right about this. How can someone say to another human being, this college love you because you're a token minority? There's something wrong about that. And I knew my phone was going to ring during this presentation. So if you all would kind of overlook it, I'll overlook it too. But how could another human being just make those kinds of comments and just not even consider that that's what's being said right now? It's so inappropriate. It's just so wrong on so many different levels. And I think that when we allow the highest in us to relate to the highest in another human being, and when that happens reciprocally, when that happens back to us, if a person is allowing the highest in them to relate to the highest in us, I think we lessen the chance of us being as hurtful and as damaging. However, it's sad to say, but sometimes the highest in some human beings isn't very high at all. And so what they give you is what they got. But yeah, you're spot on. You're spot on. Just recognizing and appreciating our humanity, I think is something we just need to do. We really need to do that. Thank you for that comment. Talked about safe spaces just a minute ago. And that's what we want to do. But I'm going to ask you again to read through this on your own, differentiate between safety versus comfort. And either in the chat box or Zoe, we can just talk about it. But safety, I feel that in this space, I can ask questions without fear of judgment. I can voice my perspective and know that I will be validated for the fact that that is my truth. Others may challenge my ideas, but that challenge is in the spirit of greater shared understanding and growth. Comfort. I feel that in this space, my reality will be agreed with, validated, and unchallenged. I don't have to explain myself to be understood, and I don't have to justify my perspective as everyone shares it. True dialogue happens in an environment where everyone is safe but not always comfortable, so that they can learn and grow. Comments, whether in the chat box or out loud, about what you see here.
I have a comment, Dr. Fleming. I'm not sure if you can hear me. My headphones don't have a microphone or not.
Okay.
Awesome. So you mentioned currently this is a safe space, and previously we talked about, naming it and calling someone out when you see something. So what recommendations do you have if you're not in a safe space and you want to call someone out for an inappropriate comment or statement, but you don't know if you actually know the right language to use, or you're afraid that you might not be able to defend yourself because you're not educated enough in that area or that topic? Do you have any recommendations for that, or some terminology or language that could be used to kind of clarify, like, I'm not an expert in this subject, but I know what you just said is not okay?
Exactly. There are some options. There are, like I shared with you, I left that 30 minutes of time at the end of class periods when I knew that sharing in class was going to really make it explosive to the point where we weren't going to get anywhere. A lot of times when you find someone who is truly, truly disrespectful of others' humanity, sometimes that person really wants to be recognized so they can really go off. And if you have the discernment to be able to tell that this person, I'm going to be really offensive, this clown is looking for a stage, and I'm not going to give it to the person. However, in certain situations, I think after the fact, pulling that person to the side, contacting that person on to the side. Now, actually, you kind of got us to the next slide, which is really brave spaces, and that's when you just let's look at this definition and see if this speaks to what you're saying, because there are those times that you kind of have to. A brave space is a place that allows you to speak freely, but not because someone gave you permission, but because you made the decision to be vulnerable and to put yourself and your opinions out there for people to hear. A brave space is a place that you create and have control over. In other words, I think you kind of suggested, Jackie, that do I allow myself to be vulnerable? I think I heard that word, or that's the word I was thinking when you were saying that there are those times that you have to just be courageous. And I always think of it this way. How important is this to me? And sometimes not even how much of an impact it's going to have on this group. But I've learned that when it is important to me, that folk know where I stand, it is important for me to allow myself to be vulnerable. Because if I'm not courageous, if I'm not brave right then, the next time the offense is going to be even worse. And so if I'm in a situation where, and I have been in this situation where someone is the person I report to, I had to make a decision. I can't really even respect myself if I don't speak up right now. And so I think Shakespeare said it very well. He said, to thine own self be true. And so the courage, I find the courage, and I make a conscious decision that I'm going to be vulnerable. I will deal with the consequences of making this choice to speak right now, and I say what I need to say, understanding that there may be some consequences. I think there are those times you have to be fearless, but if you're fearless, don't just be reckless. Do you understand? Say what needs to be said. And sometimes I think our professor said it very well. Sometimes we don't have the politically correct words, but you know what is happening is something that has to be addressed, and you got to say something to it. And so I would encourage you in those cases to make it a brave space and just decide that I'm going to say something now. Sometimes it's a professor. Sometimes it's somebody who really is responsible for creating an atmosphere whereby you can learn, but they're not doing that. And you just have to say something. You have to name it. You really have to name it. There are those times an email afterwards would work, but then there are those times you just have to really stand up. I'm at a pretty special place in my career. I am not here because I need a job. I really don't need this job. And so there are things that I just will not tolerate. And there are things that I just will not just go along with. At the same time, understanding where I am in my career, I also don't want to be reckless and just say whatever comes up and comes out. I consider who the impact of the situation. And I want to always make sure that I'm honoring another person's humanity. And it's not a tit for tat kind of thing, but there are those times that I just have to say, and I have, at the risk of thinking, this really may not work out well for me, but I have to live with myself tomorrow. I have to live with myself an hour after this thing is over. And I just can't I can't accept this microaggression right now. I just can't accept this person saying this and thinking it's okay. I don't know if I really answered your question or not. Would someone else like to speak to that?
I'm sorry, I'm raising my hand as if I'm in a classroom, but
I
I had a quick question, and I'm thinking I'm asking this not only for me, but also for everyone else who's here, students who are going to be in the job market soon. What if you are powerless? I mean, for most of the students on this session or who are in the job market or about to be in the job market, they might be getting into meetings, and once they start a job, and they clearly might know that this is not right, but for them they are powerless because they that's the job, probably that's the first job that they've got, okay, after being a student. And so do they and sometimes they might be the butt of the joke, if you will, okay, or the target of the insult, and they might they say, oh, okay, yeah, I'll take it with the flow, but they realize that if they're not a part of the group, then they might be out of a job. Yes. I remember when I was about to start working, my boss, my graduate advisor, he said that, Neil, be seen, not heard. So, and I, in other words, or in so many other words, my parents also used to say the same thing. My father, at least, he said, be seen, not heard, okay, when you're starting off. So how do you then, deal with what you just said? Because I think that's important, what you said.
Thank you. And I did qualify that I'm at a place in my career where I can do that and not have to worry about going to work tomorrow. But if you're new on a job, I think it's important to find your people or find your community. If you're new on a job, you need to make sure, number one, when you interview, that you have done your research. What is it? What do I know about this company? What are their views on certain positions that are important to me? And really do your homework before you say yes to accepting a job. Know the culture of that place. Then when you're in that space, really get to know, to the best of your ability, who's there, and find your community. Even here at Appalachian State, it's important to have a community. There are some folk that you can be completely honest with, that you feel safe around, or that you are safe with. But in that job, if there's a person who, for example, as professors, A lot of times we look at senior faculty members or folk who are tenured, who are full professors, and have relationships with those individuals. In other words, make sure you have some allies if at all possible. And make conscious decisions about which battles you're going to fight. And I would even say to a person starting out, if you see things that totally go against who you are as a person, find the person you can speak to who has the power to change that. But at the same time, understand there could be retaliation. And if there is true retaliation, there are those times that you have to just decide, I'm going to start looking, and nobody's going to know that I'm looking for a job, but I'm going to stand up. And I have found in my personal life, in my career, those times that I stood up, but I found a way of doing that with the person who really makes the decisions in the most respectful manner, helping that person understand this is my stance. And the other part of that is, if you're new on a job, then you're performing, you're doing your job, you're doing the work that has been described as your job description, so that when you do take a stance, that you're not perceived, even though you may be labeled anyway, but that you know beyond a shadow of doubt, what I'm called here to do, my actual job, I do that work, and nobody can challenge my work ethics. They're impeccable. Sometimes that folk will look past anything else and they will hear you because you are valued. You really are valued. So kind of long-winded response, I think that you should always have a community. You should have done your homework before you got there. And even when we do our homework, we don't always realize certain personalities are going to be in that workspace. But I come in, I'm here early, I'm on time, I stay until my job is done. So when I speak, I want to be able to speak from a place of an employee with impeccable work ethics, and I have a right to. And never forget, you have a right to say what you need to say. Always remember, there could be retaliation. Always remember, there could be consequences. And if so, if you're in a good job situation, there should be HR, there should be some rules, there should be some situations there that should protect you. They may not always, and especially as a person coming from a marginalized community, I always understand that sometimes the rules are not quite the same for me as they are for my counterparts who don't look like me. Anyone else like to respond to that or make a comment to that? That was a good question. That was a hard question too. All right. But it's the reality of what we deal with. All right. Can we give you maybe one or two more slides, and then I'd like to just leave this open for any questions you all might have. And I'm just going to go through, as we talk about inclusion and as students, there are three terms: diversity, differences, equity, fairness, and then inclusion. It should be active, intentional, and ongoing engagement with diversity. And I think that there are those times that you have to kind of demand, if you will, that folk understand that you belong, that you are valuable and you should be valued, that you deserve the support, and that you should not just feel safe, but that you should be safe in your work, in your school setting. These 8 identities, if I had more time, we would really get into the weeds with them, but race, ethnicity, sexual orientation, gender, identity, ability, religion, spirituality, nationality, and socioeconomic status. We bring all of who we are into every setting we go into. And the folk that we counteract and that we deal with, they bring all of who they are, all of their identities. And parts of our identity have, we have privilege and we have advantages with parts of our identity. Me being a male, me being an African-American male, being African-American sometimes undermines the social standing, my social standing. So part of my identity has privilege with it or advantage. and other parts of my identities have disadvantages. And so when we relate to another person and another person is relating to us, we need to be very aware of who we are. I think you said very well, self-awareness is really critical, but not only my self-awareness, but who am I coming into contact with? Who am I dealing with? Not going to get into this. This gets a little bit complicated, but bias, when we talk about bias as in favor or against another person, and so we need to be aware of the biases that are out there and how we've been contaminated through our families. There are certain things that have been said to us about others, whether it's religion, whether it's race, whether it's sexual orientation, all those identities that we just described. We have been given information throughout our lives about other folk. And when we learn that some of the things that we have been told about others is not true, we need to confront that contamination. We have adult information. Probably one of the worst things my dad did when we were coming up. Boys were not given certain responsibilities. There are 10 children in my family, 7 boys and 3 girls. And my dad didn't want boys to wash dishes or make beds at the house, in the house, and that sort of stuff. That was kind of designated for the girls until my dad left the house in the morning. And my mom would say, "Get your butt in that kitchen and wash those dishes." And she was not going to have my 3 sisters make up 10 beds, for the entire family. So we had those responsibilities. But I didn't realize that I had been contaminated with some of my dad's chauvinistic ideas. I remember a very dear friend here, Dr. Thalia Coleman. She and I were going to Savannah. And we were just friends, and we traveled a lot together, separate hotel rooms, all that. But we were leaving Boone to go to Savannah, Georgia. And I told her, "Thalia, I'm going to drive." And she said, "Willie, that's a long way to drive." I said, "I got this." And she said, "Willie, that's a long way to drive." And I said, "Thalia, I'm the man, I got this." I literally beat my chest and said, "I'm the man, I got this." Well, we left Boone, got to Charlotte, fine, got to Columbia. I was getting a little tired, but by the time we got to Orangeburg, South Carolina, I was zapped. And I looked over at her and said, "Well, Thalia, you think you want to drive?" And she turned right to me and said, "Oh no, you the man. The man's going to drive all the way to Savannah." And she made me drive to Savannah. Everywhere we went in Savannah, I had to drive from Savannah back to Boone. I had to drive. She said, "The man going to drive back to Boone." I kind of got delivered in that one experience. I mean, no more of that. Well, that was a silly thing to talk about. But what about if that contamination meant I would be the kind of man that I didn't listen to women in meetings, that I participated in micro invalidations? What about if I was the kind of man that when it came to women being hired, that I would hire a man over a woman, all things equal? And so that implicit bias, that unconscious bias that we have, it's a result of what we've been taught. It's a result of what we've been exposed to. But when we realize that we have that contamination, if you will, we have to address it. My friend Thalia, and I promise you, I have no problem with anybody driving me anywhere, but she really dealt with me. And I thought about that long after that. What else have I dealt with in life? What else have I been contaminated by, not just by my dad, but just my religious affiliations and all the other things? And as we talk about bias and unconscious bias, Howard Ross says this: we come to circumstances, we quickly evaluate what's going on, and then we determine something about those people, that situation. Usually we don't have time to find out whether that determination is true. And this is what makes implicit bias, unconscious bias, I use those terms interchangeably. What makes it so lethal is that we have the power to simply start interacting from there. And if I'm in a position of power, then I can really affect someone's life to the point where I can deny access. My last thing, you saw this prototype bias is another piece that really gets in the way of what we're doing and our effectiveness, because, for example, prototype bias is that we have this set notion of what a person should be, who they should be. If I have on a jersey, if I have on an athletic jersey, if I have on a golf shirt with a big A on, and I go to the Boone Mall, I promise you, every time someone would say to me, "Hi, coach, how are you?" And I'm thinking, I'm a Black man with the issue, and I look a little older than students. So the assumption is that I'm a coach. And that is just as that's a form of prototype bias, where we just make up in our minds, you look a certain way, you must be this or you must be that. I know we're running out of time, and it's always never enough time. Do we have any questions before we leave? But thank you all for your time today. Thank you for being such strong participants. Wish I had more time to be with you. I'd like to just close with a comment, a statement that Dr. King shares. And he talked about injustice anywhere is a threat to justice everywhere. And he goes further to say that we're all caught in an inescapable network of mutuality. What affects one directly affects us all indirectly. I can't be all that I ought to be until you're all that you ought to be. And you can't be all that you ought to be until I am all that I ought to be. I want to thank you for your attention. I want to thank you for your comments. And I wish the absolute best for you as you continue your work. Thank you so much for your time today. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fleming.
Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you so much, folks. I hope you really got as much as I always get from, these sessions with Dr. Fleming. Any questions? Zoe, is there, would they be getting the video if they want the URL to the video?
Yes.
The recording, sorry. Yeah.
Yes, on the Virtual Career Week website, the same place where we registered and you saw that info, they're just going to put the recording directly under, the same as we do with webinars each week. So you should get an email about that as well.
And if maybe you want to follow up with me individually, if you feel like you want to just talk more, get in the weeds, I'm always open to that. I really am. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you.
Have a great day. All right.
Thank you, Zoe.
Thank you. Thank you all.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Fleming.
You're welcome, sir.
Okay. Bye.